So this is government in the Mid-Tudor period. So basically Edward VI to Mary I. And yeah, let's take it chronologically. Edward VI. He was 9 when he inherited the throne, and because the religious situation was a bit iffy after Henry VIII's death, Henry had left the Regency Council, made up of conservatives like Paget and radicals like Seymour. So within some weeks, Somerset had overthrown the Regency Council and gained control. So there wasn't a figure like Wolsey or Cromwell during this period, but it was more, for Edward, it's Somerset and Northumberland, in that order. Somerset, Northumberland. So Somerset. Seymour, guy I just mentioned, he said, okay, I want to be the Duke of Somerset. So he named himself the Duke of Somerset in 1547, the year Henry died and the year Edward came to the throne. He was rewarding his followers and his supporters, but his government, throughout his government he rewarded them, but his government soon collapsed. It wasn't that much of a success. So his foreign policy, I'm not going to get into that because that's a whole nother video, but he was a military man. He kept on with the war with Scotland, which made him, it was really expensive. I mean, war is expensive, but it was especially expensive, and so he had to debase the coinage, which is basically decreasing the value of it. So it made inflation go off the charts, and it added to the social distress, which that's not what you want when you have a child king. Because if you have a child king, it increases the chances of a rebellion coming up, and there were two, but I'm going to get into those in a bit. And so Somerset was at his most vulnerable in 1549, which is the year of the rebellions, of both of them. Again, rebellions are a whole nother video, so I'm not going to get too much into it. But first one is the Western Rebellion, which Somerset did eventually respond. He did send forces, and he crushed that. And then the Kent's Rebellion, the rebellion was brutally suppressed. But Somerset still came off in a bad way, because he is said to have either provoked the rebellion in the West or encouraged it in East Anglia. The ongoing wars just were destroying the financial security. Not that there was much after Henry VIII. So it was just financial distress, and Somerset had taken charge. The king was, by 1549, an 11-year-old. He didn't have that much control. He did control some things, but an 11-year-old, no, it's an adult who's going to take care of this. So the blame fell on Somerset. And he was really, really close to provoking the French into another war, because we know the English love wars against the French, and almost lost Boulogne and Calais. Boulogne, Henry VIII had gained it. Calais was English, had been English for a while. And he also he wasn't popular at court because it looked like he was attempting to rule as king. So he was attempting to be kind of Wolsey, an alter Rex. But, I mean, the king was an 11-year-old. He could be really easily manipulated, and politicians took advantage of this. And, of course, Somerset had managed to at least put himself there and just be the king, the Lord Protector. But he was really unpopular. People saw him as a king in all but name. There's quite a few historical figures who are seen as a king in all but name, like Wolsey. Not quite Cromwell. Wolsey, then later on is Oliver Cromwell. Not Thomas Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell. Somerset, I don't think he had that much power as the other two, but still. And then his fall. His government eventually collapsed. He insisted on ruling with a dry stamp. He didn't delegate. He wasn't that good at it. And his arrogant and dictatorial manners created enemies. If you're going to be a dictator, you are eventually going to have some people who disagree with what you want, who disagree with whatever you pass. It's inevitable. You can't appease everyone. The Earl of Warwick and the Earl of Southampton and Archbishop Cranmer, they had a crucial place in the King's Trust. They were Protestants who liked the king liked them. So they're like, okay, we're gonna, in 1549, when Somerset's image was completely destroyed by the year of the rebellions, they're like, hey, we're here. Somerset's gonna go. Now someone else is gonna be in charge. But we got up to here. That's it. But at this point, by 1549, Somerset still controlled Edward. He was still there, right next to the king. So he kidnapped the king. He didn't kidnap him, but I don't know. He took Edward to Windsor Castle and held the king in minor imprisonment. Like, he kept the king prisoner. And then he, of course, he was scared that he was not going to be allowed to rule after that, obviously. But he was scared he was going to be killed because, he had imprisoned the king and taken him hostage. So he said, okay, fine, I'll release the king and I'll go away, you won't see me again. Unless, I will do that if you promise me you won't give me charges of treason, and I won't do that unless you guarantee my safety. So that was that. And then comes Northumberland, also the Earl of Warwick. If you remember, I mentioned him right before. He didn't try to... My dog's here. He didn't try to create a system, this system used by Somerset. He knew Somerset wasn't that popular and said, hey, I'm gonna do it this new way. Just wait a second. Okay, I'm back. So Northumberland had said, okay, I'm not gonna do what Somerset did. That was a failure. So I'm gonna be Lord President of the Council instead of Protector. Like, that makes a difference. I mean, the title is, but he had to outmaneuver conservatives and radicals. He had to outmaneuver everyone and basically put himself on top. How he did this? Putting them against each other. It's a really successful technique, just putting people up against each other and causing fights. He was smart. He delegated responsibility to those that had superior knowledge. He knew he wasn't the best at everything. So he said, okay, if I want something to do with finances, I'm going to delegate it to this guy. To that. So he gave power to his friends and powerful people, which made him stay in power, basically. And he outwitted Somerset, who tried to plan a counter coup. So he was smart about that. Again, foreign policy, I'm not really going to get into that because that's for another video, but he put an end to the wars with Scotland and France and debased the coinage only to rebase it. So that's foreign policy. I mean, that's foreign policy under Northumberland isn't that big. It's more under Somerset. But then here comes trade. Again, not that big a deal by then. It was beginning to lack. Trade wasn't as strong as it had been back in Henry VIII or even Henry VII. By the time Northumberland came to power, it wasn't that big. Like I said, by 1550, Antwerp, the port town in the Netherlands, I think so, yeah. It collapsed. It had been failing, and then it collapsed in 1550. And he began looking for new outlets. He began looking for new places to trade. He found the Gold Coast in Africa, and he began pushing for the New World, America. But that wasn't that much. That wasn't successful. Not really. So, yeah. That was. I mean, Edward only ruled for 6 years. And by Edward, I mean his ministers, because I don't know to what extent Edward had decisions. But in terms of government, it was basically Somerset and Northumberland. And then here comes the big question, the big thing, if you will, the whole succession crisis. So Henry VIII has said, okay, if Edward dies childless, then Mary is going to take the throne. And if Mary were to die childless, Elizabeth would take the throne. Seems simple enough, right? But hey, it's a young king. Nothing's gonna happen. We're not gonna have to worry about this until like 1570 something. No. In January 1553, Edward took ill. He was ill, and we were thinking, oh God, he's gonna die, isn't he? What are we gonna do about succession? By March, he was straight up dying, and this was a huge problem. Obviously, under the succession thing set up by Henry VIII, it was said that Mary was going to come to the throne, but she was a known Catholic, and everyone knew she was going to impose a harsh Catholicism. Northumberland, he was very Protestant. He was the more radical out of the two, out of Somerset, and his Protestant policies, especially during, like, I had a video on this, during his later part of Edward's reign, it would certainly fire him. If not, like, that was the best case scenario, he was going to be executed. And he had to stop, by whatever means, Mary coming to the throne. As we all know now, that wasn't successful. But so Edward II had an urge to stop Mary from coming to the throne. They didn't get along that well, especially because Protestant Catholic. And he knew he had put a lot of hard work into into turning and solidifying England's Protestantism. So he knew the second she came to the throne, she would just undo it, and all his work would be for nothing. Which kind of was what happened. So if you look at it, it's Henry VIII, and Edward built on what Henry VIII did. Mary looks at what Edward did, throws it away. Elizabeth looks at what Mary did, throws it away. And that's Tudor religion for you. But there's going to be more videos on that, don't worry. And yeah, so he made the device, which would ruin Northumberland's reputation and kind of cause an uprising. But that was not Edward's problem. Question is, what is the device? It was a slight alteration to Edward's will, which meant that if he should die childless, the throne would go to Lady Jane Grey's male heirs. Lady Jane Grey was the daughter-in-law of Northumberland. Northumberland had a lot of influence on the king, and apparently Jane Grey was a candidate for marriage with Edward. Anyway, but by March, when he was dying, Jane Grey had no sons. So it was changed to say to Lady Jane Grey and her heirs male. So, basically, the son would go to Lady Jane Grey and then her sons. Which, I mean, seems like a plan, right? Northumberland loved this, and he pushed for this because she was his daughter-in-law. He would be in so much favor with her, and he would be able to further his own standing. Yet she was 15, I think, by the time. So she was older than Edward, but no, older. She was the same age as Edward, yeah, and she would be able to influence her. And yeah, although this can also be attributed to Edward rather than Northumberland, because he had his own independent reasons, like I said, preserving Protestantism. So I'd say the device was more both of us, a combination of the two, of Edward and Northumberland. Although there wasn't really a plan for implementing this, there was no army ready, there was no strategy. It was just, yeah, Lady Jane Grey is gonna be queen. Okay, normal people know about Mary. They don't know about Lady Jane Grey. They don't care about Lady Jane Grey. Mary found out, and she was prepared, and turns out Mary was crowned Queen of England on the 19th of July. Lady Jane Grey she wasn't crowned, she did rule England for a whole 9 days, therefore becoming the 9-day queen. So that was Edward's government. There's not that much of a governmental structure per se. I mean, it's Somerset, the Northumberland, and the most significant thing is the device and all the succession crisis. Mary is a bit more complicated. So let's get into her. The support of her claim was quite strong. During the whole succession crisis, people wanted her to to go to the throne, she was Catholic, because it is believed that the majority of England by this point was Catholic. I think I said something about this in my video on Edward's religion. But yeah, the majority of the country was Catholic, and she had been the clear heir. Lady Jane was this nobody. I mean, she was a noble, but she was this nobody who didn't really matter to the people. And she knew that because she had so much support, that England must have wanted a return to Catholicism, so that gave her more hope and encouraged her. She, and apart from being the Catholicism thing, it was also because the Tudor government had been there since 1485, and this was 1553, so almost 70 years. There was already a loyalty to the dynasty, so like changing to another dynasty, a bit boring. I mean, there was no living memory of the Wars of the Roses by this point. Most of them had died already, but they didn't want to be changing dynasties like, back and forth. They just, hey, Mary's a comfortable choice. People began, like, before Edward had died, this is like right at the end of his reign, people began like, going to churches and putting up all the things because they said, okay, Mary's going to come to the throne. She's Catholic. She's going to let us do this. So why put it off? So Edward was on his deathbed. Meanwhile, people in churches all over the country were just putting things up. And by August, this was when Mary was already queen, it was already Catholic. Like London was already Catholic. They couldn't have done that in a month. They had to have started before Mary was crowned and before Edward died. So the return didn't cause much trouble. Although Mary she hadn't been brought up to rule. She was the first daughter of Henry VIII, but she knew she was a woman, so she wasn't gonna rule because Henry would have a male heir, and then when Edward was born, she's like, okay, and that's it, now we're going to be queen. But then Edward got sick, and she was suddenly queen. She wasn't politically astute. She appointed 50 councillors during her reign. Mind you, this was a 5-year reign from 1453, when Edward died, to 1558. 1553 to 1558, yes. And it caused a lot of factional rivalry. Her marriage to Philip, which is, I'm going to get into that in a bit, that was never formally discussed by the council. It was only through the inner circle councillors like Gardiner, Winchester, Paget, and it really relied heavily on foreign advisors like the Spanish ambassador Renard and her husband Philip. Poor Philip, who wanted to be king of Spain. So the whole deal with the Spanish marriage. If Mary died, like I said before, Elizabeth would become queen. Mary did not want this because she knew Elizabeth was Protestant. So she wanted to stop by all means a Protestant reform, because she was planning on turning the country to Catholicism and then just keeping it that way for the rest of her life and the rest of England. This is life. So she came to the throne by age 37, which by these days is not that old, but by those times, like in Tudor period, life expectancy was like 40, and she was ancient. She was really old, and her priority was to produce a child. So the line of her daughter or son, preferably a son, would become the next king. So for her to have a child, she needed a husband, and it didn't work. You can have a child before. You can have a bastard. But there was this guy, Edward Courtenay, who was an English contender for her hand. He lacked court skills, and if you think about it, this is more of an issue with Elizabeth, but if an Englishman marries a queen, that's going to cause so much factionalism, so much rivalry. It's going to be chaotic. So the next best thing was Philip. Now England by this time, and I don't, maybe even today, England was famously xenophobic. They hated foreign powers, even a foreign king, whereas the Spanish king comes to rule England. So Spain was involved in so many wars. By this one, it was really a really powerful country. So they were afraid that if Philip became king, England would become Spanish territory and just be dragged into wars all the time because Spain just couldn't stop itself from going to wars. And also Philip would become the king of England and just dominate over Mary, because that's how things were back then. The male had more power than the female. There was a treaty made up. Mary thought around and said, hey, okay, fine. I need to marry Philip because he's a Spanish monarch, therefore a Catholic monarch, and it would give us a great alliance with Spain. I think we should do this. You don't want me to marry him because we're going to get dragged into Spain. Don't worry, I have a plan. Well, not her, but her counselors. A treaty was drawn up that said Philip would be king, but he wouldn't have any of the power. He would be king by name only. So you know how I said before that Somerset was a king in all but name? Well, Philip was a king in nothing but name. He was just king of England. But then Mary died, and he didn't get to marry Elizabeth, so he stopped being king of England. If that treaty hadn't been drawn up, Philip would have been king of England. So that treaty also made it illegal for any foreign men to hold offices. You can be Lord of the Treasury. If you were foreign, you had to be English to do that. You could have a small role, but not a big one. And it was designed to calm the public fears. Now, if Mary died before Philip wouldn't become king, like I just said, but that didn't stop people from rebelling. There was a whole rebellion, which I'm not really going to get into it because that's, like I said with Edward, a whole nother video. Maybe I'll group Edward rebellions and Mary rebellions together, like I did here. The marriage didn't take place until July of 1555, I think. I'm not sure. Yes, 1555. If I'm wrong, I'll correct it in the descriptions, but I think it's 1555. So they met on the 23rd of July and got married on the 25th. And it just failed at a political level. Mary didn't produce an heir. She had many false pregnancies. And England, like many had suspected, was drawn into another war with France because there was a Habsburg-Valois conflict. Spain versus France, England dragged there, and she ended up losing Calais. But that's a whole other video, like I said. So, in 1555, there was an anti-Spanish pope. So, Mary did not get along with the pope. She tried, but it wasn't that they hated each other. She did get their excommunication was reversed, but it wasn't so much as collaboration as she had wanted. So here, the next part of government is Parliament. There was cautious cooperation. I'd say Mary and Parliament got along with Mary. It's not that they agreed on everything, but they also didn't disagree on everything, so that's good. I just say they had a healthy relationship. They collaborated. It's not like Parliament during the reign of in the Stuarts, Charles I, where there was a whole civil war and the king ended up decapitated, and that's not what you want. So, yeah, Mary and Parliament was not too bad. There was only 80 MPs opposed Edwardian, like the reversal of Edwardian Reformation. They returned ex-monastic property to the church. A bill in Parliament was passed in 1555 in which the government was allowed to seize land by Protestant exiles. There were a ton of Marian exiles during her reign, so if they left land, the government could just take it because they're not here to protest, and if they came back, Mary could just burn them at the stake. Well, the whole thing with Bloody Mary, that's a whole Elizabethan propaganda. I'm not gonna get into that because that's a whole deal. Yeah. In I think it's 1554, the marriage. 1554. I'm gonna put that in the description just to make sure. But I think it's 1554 now. Yeah. Parliament refused Philip to be crowned king. They didn't want him to be king of England. He did get crowned, but in 1554 they rejected this bill, which included him under the protection of the treason laws, therefore showing the xenophobia. Although one thing that Parliament did that Mary was not happy with, they didn't let her exclude Elizabeth from the succession. So there were more defeats for Mary than for Parliament. She knew she couldn't push her political opinions on Parliament, and she learned how to handle English politics eventually. But it was only a short reign, 5 years. And so now I'm gonna tell you about some of the reforms Mary did. It was actually quite successful. I wouldn't say it was a complete failure. Then I'm gonna get into the debate of the whole Mid-Tudor crisis after this. But I wouldn't say the whole Marian reign was a failure. It was actually quite successful, although because of the short period of time in which it happened, only 5 years, the main beneficiary was Elizabeth. So Elizabeth's early years were like I think it was the trade was amazing, the economy was quite good. Mary suffered quite a harsh harvest, but she made it back, but that only showed after she died. So Mary gets really a bad rep. I think she wasn't that bad of a monarch. It's just she lived for too short amount of time. So financial reforms, the Duke of Northumberland, I don't think it's the same Northumberland as before. It's that he set up a commission in. Oh no, yes, it's the same. What I'm saying, it's the same Northumberland. He set up a commission headed by Milday in Edward's reign to investigate shortcomings of the financial administration system. Tudor finances were a bit of a mess during the Mid-Tudor crisis because Henry had debased the coins so many times because of his wars with France. So Edward suffered, but Mary suffered the most. And his fall from power prevented any of the recommendations from being implemented. Milday was kept, but he was regarded suspiciously because, he was Protestant, and all the reforms were eventually implemented in 1554. The security of the crown's finances were reinforced with recoinage. Northumberland had recoined. No. Yeah, recoined. Yeah. Northumberland had rebased the coinage. Mary did it again. This was all drawn out from 1556 to 1558. Although, like I said, it didn't show up in Mary. Mary didn't get to see the benefits of this. It was Elizabeth. Elizabeth kind of had it easy for her at the beginning. I'm not saying her reign was easy, no. It's just the beginning, she reaped the benefits of Mary's, and then she handled things on her own, and then until 1570 something, that was the golden years, and then everything, I'm saying went to chaos, but that's Elizabeth. I'm not going to get into that. So Mary and her reign published a new book of rates. Obviously not by her, but she did publish. It was published during her reign, and it increased dramatically customs revenue. Again, not really that fruitful for her. Only Elizabeth. She saw a lot of the planning and preparation of financial reforms implemented by Elizabeth. So Mary left on the table plans for financial systems that would be amazing for England's economy. Elizabeth, when Mary died, she came to the throne, saw all these plans, said, hey, they're genius, I'm going to implement these, and implemented them. Thus, the golden age of Elizabeth. but not that, like, not to say Elizabeth wasn't a successful monarch, but it was more Mary than her sister. She did put naval and militia reforms. There was a complete reform of the financial and administrative areas of the military. 6 new ships were built and many others repaired. And increased peacetime budget to 14,000. I find this really funny because 6 new ships were built, many others repaired, and wartime budget increased to £14,000. This was all like Philip. Philip gave her the money. Yeah, Philip later attacked Elizabeth in 1588 in the whole Spanish Armada, and his own ships, which by the way had his own crest of arms in there, were the ones who defeated him. So the Spanish Armada was defeated by Philip, technically, if you think about it. I just find it really funny. Like, he paid for his own military failure. And by the time he thought Mary would live for a long time and he wouldn't have to worry about it, then Elizabeth died. He tried to marry Elizabeth. He didn't really want to, but he attempted. Got rejected, obviously. And then he launched the Catholic Crusade to invade England because of what he had done in Mary's reign. I'm not saying all the boats were a significant part, but they had the boats. They couldn't have. Like, Elizabeth could not have beaten the Spanish Armada. It was Philip's own downfall, if you think about it. And back to Mary's reign, I'm sorry. There were changes to the methods of raising an army. So it was important for a country with no standing army. Because, yeah. Oops. And then reforms for the towns. A strong government presence was now in the towns. And, yeah, she had more of a power in small areas rather than just leaving it to local officials. Now she had a strong government presence. She fulfilled the needs that had been created by the changes resulting from the Reformation. After the Reformation, England's political scene was a bit chaotic. So Mary had to ensure that things were stable and Catholicism was being implemented and maintained as it should. It destroyed institutions that were organized like the Poor Relief and took over by boroughs. So, what was Poor Relief? 1556 to 1558 were horrible years for England. Not only was there an influenza epidemic with huge mortality rates, but there were terrible harvests, like terrible. And taxation was so high because of the wars with France, not only because of the wars with France by Henry, but also by the wars with France with Edward, and of course with Mary herself. The government kept emphasizing laws against hoarders of money because the country needed the money. You couldn't just keep that money to yourself. And it encouraged the conversion of pasture land to tillage. So that was more governmental reforms that are very more economic than government. But there's not a whole category for government reform, so I just put it into government. Government is more significant under Elizabeth and Henry VIII. Henry VII and Edward VI and Mary I didn't have that much of a governmental presence, I don't think. So yeah. Now comes the question of the Mid-Tudor crisis. Was there a Mid-Tudor crisis? That's the question. The Mid-Tudor period always refers to the reigns of Edward and Mary. If you group them together like I did for this video, it's from 1547 to 1558, 11 years. By 2 monarchs, one of them 6, one of them 5 years. It was 2 little Tudors, had very short reigns compared to, and Henry VII reigned from 1485 to 1509. So 24 years. Henry VIII reigned from 1509 to 1547. So 38 years. And then Elizabeth reigned from 1558 to 1603. So 45 years. So you take the really big chunks of time, and you have an 11-year period which had 2 monarchs. Right? Henry and Elizabeth's reign were really long, really dramatic. There was a government establishment, religious institutions, policies they're still present today. And Elizabeth's 39 articles still form the basis of the church. That's another video. But you can't deny that Edward and Mary did a lot of significant things, and without Mary's financial reforms, Elizabeth would not have been that successful. Much of the the reputation of Northumberland was restored, which is quite an achievement. And Mary's reign, like I said, had a lot of things that you had to give her credit for. You can't just ignore all the financial reforms she did. The religious turmoil can still be seen in Elizabeth's reign, with rebellions focusing on the north, and social dislocation was as evident in fact by 1590, so well into Elizabeth's reign, 30-something years into Elizabeth's reign. That like in 1549, social dislocation. There was still polarizations in English society. So I don't think there was a mid-Tudor crisis per se. I'd say there was not a crisis. That's not the word. I don't think there's a word for it. It's just a short period which was significant, and you can't ignore it. You can't ignore Edward and Mary's reign. You can't just talk about the Tudors and talk about Henry VII, and especially Henry VIII and Elizabeth. Yes, they were significant, but what about the other two, the little Tudors? So yeah, that's the whole mid-Tudor crisis thing. Then there's a whole issue with religion and rebellions and foreign policy. And Mary's foreign policy is really interesting, but I'm going to get into that much later on. So you have to wait for that video. So yeah, that's government in the mid-Tudor period. Thank you for watching.